The other thing to note is that, and even Paine said this, that the stuff that he wrote wasn't new, and the stuff in the Constitution wasn't really new. The Whigs in England at the time were arguing the same thing. And it was coming about from what happened in Europe before that. A little bit more about Paine. I love this first quote. Really, Adams is saying that our country wouldn't exist as it did without Paine. It doesn't matter what Washington did. If it didn't have the backing of Paine and his words, we wouldn't exist the way we do. Some of the things I said before, common sense roused the population. The crisis with the 16 pamphlets, that's where you get the words, these are the times to try men's souls. So the very first line of the first pamphlet is that quote, and it's something everybody knows today. But neither one of these two were considered founders of the country. You know why? Anybody? Bueller? Mostly because they weren't signatories. So they didn't actually sign the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. So they aren't really considered founders. So let's talk about the founders a little bit. And I put many up here because I actually grabbed this from some documentation that I found. And later, I found at least partial evidence that there were only 5 deists, not many, because there were actually quite a few signers of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So they weren't Christian, and they wouldn't have called themselves Christian, but remember the times. People were Christian almost by default. I mean, everybody was religious, really, and they all believed in God. And even these 5 that weren't Christian, they were what they would call deists. And hopefully you know what that is. Everybody know what deist is? I got a few nods. So deists are people that believe some form of higher being created the universe to start with, and then kind of let it go. And maybe they formed it in just the right way so that we would end up with humanity if you really want to stretch it. But they don't think it's a personal God. They don't think that God is involved with us today. You can't pray to him and get an answer. There's no reason to use that God for any arguments in how we should live or our laws. And that's what the deists were. The other thing that I found interesting on a Mormon site, and I'll actually read this piece, and this is actually from a Mormon site about religions. And it says, for the right of free exercise of their religion, Christians owe a debt to the 5 founding fathers, who are not Christians, but rather deists. These 5 are Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams, and James Madison. And I found it interesting that Washington was in there, because there's no evidence that says that he was actually a deist. There's some references to other people saying they think he thinks like a deist. But he was very personal about his religion. He believed it should be personal to everybody, and he never claimed to be a deist or a Christian. He just didn't claim. So they say it in here, but there's no real evidence to that. The other thing about Benjamin Franklin's quote at the end I found interesting was how it shows kind of both sides. He's saying that the affairs of the world, that the men are saved not by faith, but by the lack of it. But he limits this to the affairs of the world, not to affairs after life. They still believed in an afterlife. So you have to remember that. He was being very clear that our laws and our life should be based on a lack of religion. But he wasn't referring to the afterlife when he said that. So, they might have, they weren't specifically Christian, they might not have been, but they did believe in a single God. They tended to believe in an afterlife, so they were certainly religious in some form. They really couldn't stand the religious organizations, and you have to remember where they came from at this point, right? They believed the Christian tenets, but they didn't like the organized side of religion because they had seen what it did to people. What it did to Europe, if you think about the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, and countries that were saying, okay, now I'm this religion or now I'm that religion. They couldn't stand that, and they wanted everybody to have the right to believe the way they wanted to, but they were still somewhat religious. The other thing is you have to look at the origins of the population at the time. So they're fleeing persecution from Europe, right? And they have been fleeing that for a couple of hundred years. The tact the countries in Europe were taking, and the religions specifically in Europe, were that the population could only work well if they were kind of cohesive. They were homogeneous. They had to be of one religion. So when the rulers were a particular religion, they demanded everybody in the country to be the same religion, and there are lists and lists and lists of people being kicked out of the country, taken out of their homes if they refused to convert to the religion of the ruler, even if another ruler came along 30 years later and changed their religion. And they couldn't stand this anymore, and they wanted people to have the right to believe the way they wanted to. Let's see. So, this is a little bit before we actually have a federal government, right? Let's look at the state declarations before we look at the federal declarations. And what's fascinating is how many of the actual individual states declared they were a specific religion. So we tend to think today, well, the Constitution doesn't mention religion, not once, but it's in a negative sense. The Declaration of Independence kind of mentions a divine being 4 times, but it has limited use. But the states themselves actually went through and declared religion, many of them. And it says here, the Anglican, if you didn't recognize it, is the Church of England. So in the none here, just to note, doesn't mean non-Christian. Doesn't actually mean they were atheist. What it probably meant was they couldn't actually decide on which of the Protestant religions the state was in general, or there was just enough of a mix that they couldn't pick one. So they just said, well, we're not a specific religion, but it doesn't mean they're not Christian. They were probably still Christian. They just weren't a particular sect. The other ones to note, notice Delaware, which says none, because the next slide will say otherwise. It'll be interesting to see the difference between the two. And then note Virginia, which is down at the bottom over here. Look at that, I pointed. Which says it's Anglican, but then had a very secular constitution that Jefferson wrote and got a lot of flack for. So they may have claimed it in one meeting and then wrote a constitution that was very different. So you have to keep that in mind. So there's a couple of examples. There's actually, I found 16 different state constitutions that reference something like this. And the key notes here, if you look at this, it says that you had to believe in the Christian religion in order to be qualified for any kind of state office, right? You actually had to believe in the Christian religion. And the one about Delaware goes further. It actually talks about not only Christian religion, but God the Father, and in Jesus Christ, His only Son, and the Holy Ghost, one God. And it goes on, and you have to believe in the Holy Scriptures that they're divine inspiration. How many of you read the Bible? That can't be inspired by anything that knew what he was doing, or she. And there were 16 of these, literally, that had in their constitutions, in their state constitutions, some limit that said that you had to be Christian of some sort. I went back to their current constitutions, and they don't have these clauses anymore, thankfully. The Maryland one has been through 4 revisions, and I didn't look at all of them, but the very last one doesn't have anything